I always thought I had a good marriage. We were in it for the long haul, together for over a decade, with our kids, our house, and our lives more or less figured out. Sure, like any couple, we had our ups and downs, but overall, things were steady. We had a routine that worked for us. I'd go to work, she'd handle things at home, and we'd meet up after work, swap stories about our days, maybe have dinner, watch a show. There wasn't much to complain about. But then, out of nowhere, the bombshell hit. One night, while we were getting ready for bed, she dropped a comment that made my stomach drop. "I think I'm ready to leave you." I froze. I thought it was some kind of bad joke or maybe just a weird moment of honesty, but she was serious. I tried to act like I hadn't just been punched in the gut, but I couldn't hide the shock and the hurt that immediately hit me. I remember asking her why, and the answer was simple. She said she didn't feel the spark anymore, that she was drifting away. That was it. The woman I'd spent over a decade with was telling me that she was done. It didn't feel real. I didn't know what to do with that information, but it cut deep. The shock was the hardest part at first. I couldn't wrap my head around it. I kept thinking, this isn't happening. We've been through too much together for it to just end like this. But the more I tried to convince myself it was some sort of misunderstanding, the more I realized that she meant every word. She wasn't crying, wasn't apologizing, just stating the facts like it was a done deal. I felt like I was drowning in confusion. Why didn't I see this coming? Was I that blind? The anger came later, after the initial shock faded. I couldn't understand how she could just shut me out like that. All those years we spent building a life together, and now it was being torn down by a few words. I was furious. Not just at her, but at myself too. How could I have missed the signs? Had I really been that oblivious to her unhappiness? The anger felt like a weight on my chest, and I started to question everything about our relationship. It was like the ground beneath me had been pulled away, and I was just floating, not sure where I was supposed to land. As the days passed, the anger started to fade, but something worse settled in: sadness. I found myself sitting in our house, staring at the walls, the quiet feeling overwhelming. The same house we'd shared for so many years now felt empty, foreign. Every corner, every picture on the wall, reminded me of what I was losing. I couldn't escape the weight of it. I'd sit in our living room, thinking about all the little moments that we had shared, things I took for granted. I'd look at the couch where we used to laugh together, our favorite spot where we'd watch movies, the kitchen table where we'd have coffee in the mornings. It felt like she was already gone, even though she was still there, making plans to leave. It wasn't just the loss of her. It was the loss of our life together, the life I thought we were building. The kids, the shared dreams, the promise of growing old together. All of that felt like a cruel joke now. And then, in the midst of all that sadness, there was a moment when I just broke down. I sat in the bathroom one night, the door locked, and cried harder than I'd ever cried in my life. I hadn't realized how much I had been holding in, how much I had hoped she would change her mind. But she hadn't, and she wasn't going to. I was alone, even though I was surrounded by everything that used to matter to me. I had always known my wife had a dry sense of humor, sometimes a little dark, sometimes sarcastic, but always with that unique wit. After the shock wore off, and I was in the thick of the sadness, something strange happened that changed my perspective, even just a little. We were sitting in our living room one evening, a few days after everything had been said and done. It was awkward. She was on one side of the room, I was on the other, both of us lost in our thoughts. Then, without warning, she made a comment. "You know," she said, looking up from her phone, "if you end up getting some new girlfriend, I hope she likes cheesy rom-coms. I don't think I can handle watching another one with you." I was stunned for a second. My heart tightened, but then, it hit me. She wasn't just saying that as a jab. She was laughing. Her tone wasn't angry or cold. It was that familiar, joking way she always had. It was like an old inside joke we used to share. It reminded me of how, even when things were rough, we still found ways to laugh. I couldn't help it, I chuckled. It wasn't a loud laugh, but it was a genuine one, and for a moment, I felt a sense of relief, a small but powerful break in the tension. It felt like maybe we were okay for just that second. And in that instant, I realized something. The humor we shared, the things that used to bind us, they weren't gone. She wasn't as far gone as I thought. She looked at me, and I could see it in her eyes. This was her humor, something she'd always appreciated. I think she wanted me to laugh. She knew it was absurd, but it was her way of saying, I'm still here, even if it's not in the way you want me to be. And so, I laughed again, like it wasn't a betrayal, but a strange sort of acceptance. She smiled, almost like she was relieved to see me react that way. It wasn't a happy moment, but it was a small step forward, and it felt okay. After that odd moment of laughter, things didn't get any easier. In fact, they were about to get even harder. The reality of what was happening still sat heavily on my chest, but I began to find myself thinking more clearly. For the first time, I started to really understand the situation, not just from my perspective, but from hers too. She wasn't just walking away from me, she was walking away from the life we'd built together. The kids, the home, everything. She was scared, and maybe, in some way, I was too. I didn't want her to leave. I didn't want our family to break. But part of me also understood. She had been unhappy for so long, and I hadn't noticed. I kept thinking about the little things, the times she seemed distant, the way she'd shrug off plans or not really connect in conversation. Maybe I had been so wrapped up in my own world, I hadn't seen how much she was struggling. I knew I had a choice. I could try to fight for our marriage, for what we had left, or I could let go, accept that things were different now. It wasn't easy. Every day felt like I was living in a fog of doubt. One minute I wanted to fight for us, to hold on with everything I had. The next, I just felt exhausted by the thought of trying to fix something that was already broken. Eventually, after talking a lot, and crying even more, I realized something crucial: I couldn't force her to stay. If she wasn't happy, if she didn't feel the same way anymore, I had to let her go. The decision wasn't easy, but it became clear over time. I had to make peace with the fact that I couldn't change what had already happened. It wasn't a defeat. It was acceptance. It didn't mean I loved her any less, it meant I loved her enough to let her go. That was the hardest part for me, but also the most necessary. Letting go wasn't just a decision I made in one day. It was a process. A painful, messy process. After we had that conversation, it became clear that there was no going back. She moved into another room, and the atmosphere in the house shifted. It was like living with a stranger, someone I knew intimately but no longer recognized. I remember the first few nights, lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling like an outsider in my own life. The hardest part was seeing her still around, going through the motions of daily life, but knowing she was already gone. She still made dinner, still asked about the kids' schoolwork, but there was a distance in her voice, in her eyes. It felt like she was a ghost, just going through the motions until the inevitable came. I spent days and nights wrestling with my emotions. One moment I'd feel okay, almost like the weight had lifted, but then the next, it would all come crashing down again. The sadness would flood me, memories of us as a family, of the time we had spent building our lives together, all slipping through my fingers. I remember one particularly difficult evening. She was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, and I was in the kitchen, just staring at the sink. I wanted to say something, to ask her how she was feeling, but the words wouldn't come out. What could I possibly say at that point? Please don't leave? It would have sounded pathetic. But I needed closure. I needed to face the reality, to stop pretending that things could somehow go back to what they were. Slowly, over time, I started to accept that she was leaving, and I had to let her go. It wasn't easy. There were moments I wanted to fight, moments I wanted to scream and beg. But eventually, I realized that this wasn't about holding on anymore. It was about finding a way to breathe again. And little by little, that started to happen. Once I finally accepted that she was leaving, I realized I had to rebuild. Not just our family, but myself. For so long, my identity had been tied to being a husband, a father, and part of a unit. Now, that unit was breaking apart, and I had to learn how to stand on my own. At first, it felt like I was just going through the motions. Work was a distraction, but I wasn't really present there. I could barely focus on meetings, and I would often catch myself staring off into space, thinking about what had gone wrong, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. But as time went on, I started doing little things for myself. I began going to the gym again. It wasn't much at first, just walking on the treadmill, trying to push myself past the guilt I felt for focusing on myself, but it was something. I started picking up hobbies I had neglected. I joined a book club, even though I never thought I'd be someone to do that. Slowly, I was rediscovering who I was outside of the role I had played in our marriage. It wasn't easy. There were still nights where I'd lie awake, thinking about her and the kids, wondering how they were doing. I missed the way she used to make fun of me for not knowing how to fold a fitted sheet or how she'd steal the covers at night. But I also started noticing the things that had been missing in my own life, things I had sacrificed in trying to maintain a family that was no longer there. I'd forgotten how to take care of myself, how to enjoy the little things. The more I focused on these small steps, the more I began to feel like I was getting back to myself, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like a victory. I wasn't fixed. I wasn't whole yet, but I was starting to piece myself back together. It wasn't about replacing what I had lost, but about rediscovering who I was without her. The funny thing about grief and loss is how it forces you to lean on people you never expected to. I had always kept my emotions close to the chest, especially when it came to friends. But after the separation, I found myself opening up to people I hadn't talked to in years, friends from work, old acquaintances from college. I started having lunch with people I didn't realize I had a lot in common with. There was one guy, Jim, from my old office, who I hadn't spoken to much beyond surface-level chats. But one day, I ran into him at a coffee shop. He looked at me, noticed how worn out I looked, and before I even had the chance to say anything, he just said, "You okay? You don't look like yourself." It was the most direct thing anyone had said to me in months. I didn't want to burden him with my problems, but there was something in his eyes, genuine concern, and before I knew it, I found myself spilling everything. I told him about the breakup, the emptiness, the sadness. To my surprise, Jim didn't offer any quick fixes or the usual "it'll get better" crap. Instead, he just listened. He let me talk, uninterrupted. And in that moment, it was like I could finally breathe a little. He understood, not because he'd been through the exact same thing, but because he knew what it felt like to lose something important. He had his own past, his own stories. That conversation turned into a weekly coffee meeting. I started looking forward to it every week, not because I was looking for solutions, but because Jim was just a guy who listened, who didn't try to fix everything, but understood that sometimes, all you need is someone to talk to. It was the first real support I had outside of family. Those little moments of human connection helped me more than I could have imagined. They gave me the space to process, and slowly, I began to heal. It's strange how, in the midst of heartache, you can find little moments that make everything feel just a bit more bearable. I'd been through so much darkness, but every now and then, something would happen that would make me think maybe things weren't as bad as I thought. One day, I was out running errands, nothing special, just the usual, picking up groceries and whatnot. I was walking through the produce section when I saw a mother and her daughter. The little girl, probably around 5 years old, grabbed a bunch of bananas and said, "Mom, look. I'm going to make a banana smoothie." She was so enthusiastic, so innocent. Her mom laughed, ruffling her hair, and said, "All right, let's get everything we need." I stood there for a second, watching them, and it hit me. The kind of joy that little girl had, it was simple. Pure. She was happy because she had a banana and a plan to make a smoothie. That was it. And in that moment, I remembered how to enjoy small things again. For the first time in a long while, I felt grateful. It was like I could see the possibility of happiness again, not in big things, but in the simple moments. The ones that don't have to be perfect to be valuable. It wasn't like I was magically over the pain, not by a long shot. But I started realizing that it was possible to feel joy again, even if just for a few seconds. And I didn't need to have everything figured out to start finding it. I didn't go home that day and jump into some huge revelation about my life. But I did notice the sunlight coming through the windows a little more, and I did enjoy that first bite of a sandwich, even though it was just a sandwich. Those small moments were a reminder that life goes on, even when you feel like you've lost everything. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A glimpse of hope that, even after everything, there was something to hold on to. I was starting to settle into my new normal, figuring out how to balance being a single parent and doing things for myself again. It wasn't perfect, but it was manageable. That was, until one evening when I went out for drinks with some friends. It was a casual thing, nothing special, just a way to get out of my head. I hadn't expected to see anyone from my past, but that's exactly what happened. There, sitting at a corner booth, was Lisa. Lisa was my college girlfriend. We'd parted ways years ago, not on bad terms, but life had just pulled us in different directions. She was the one who had always understood me in ways that no one else had back when I was young and still figuring out who I was. Seeing her again hit me like a freight train. She looked exactly the same, beautiful, confident, and still radiating the same energy I remembered. At first, I didn't even know if I should approach her. I didn't want to be that guy who had just gone through a painful breakup and was now trying to reconnect with old flames. But something about her presence made me feel lighter. We started talking, and immediately, it felt like no time had passed. We laughed about stupid college memories, about the people we had been back then. It was comfortable, familiar, and, surprisingly, it made me feel good. It wasn't anything romantic at first, it was just two people reconnecting after years apart. But as the night went on, something shifted. There was a spark, a connection that I hadn't realized was still there. We talked about our lives, our struggles, and eventually, I found myself telling her about everything that had happened, about my marriage, the separation, how it had shattered me. I was amazed at how easy it was to talk to her, how she didn't judge or offer unsolicited advice, but just listened. And, to my surprise, I realized something. I wasn't looking to replace what I had lost. I wasn't trying to fill the hole left by my wife. What I was realizing was that life didn't have to stop just because one chapter had closed. There was still room for new connections, for new experiences. And maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than I had been allowing myself to see. That night, we didn't make any promises. We just talked, laughed, and enjoyed each other's company. But it was the first time in a long while that I felt like maybe I was ready to let someone in again. The more I thought about that night with Lisa, the more I realized how important it was. Not because of the potential for a romance or rekindling an old relationship, but because it reminded me that I could still connect with people. I could still share parts of myself, still be open to others without the baggage of past pain constantly dragging me down. That night sparked something in me that had been buried deep under the weight of everything. It was like I was rediscovering myself in a way I hadn't expected. I'd spent so much time focused on the things I had lost, but this encounter reminded me that there was more to me than the pain. I started thinking about forgiveness, not just for her, but for myself. Up until that point, I had been holding on to anger, frustration, and even self-blame. I couldn't forgive myself for not seeing the cracks in the marriage sooner. I couldn't forgive her for betraying the trust we'd built. But as I started to look at everything more objectively, I realized something important. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing the hurt. It wasn't about saying what happened was okay. It was about freeing myself from the emotional prison I had built around my own heart. Forgiving her, letting go of the anger, and accepting the truth that things were over, it wasn't easy. It was one of the hardest things I had ever done. But over time, I learned that forgiveness wasn't just a gift I gave to her, it was a gift I gave to myself. It was the first real step I could take toward healing. I started seeing life a little differently after that. I spent more time with the kids, focused on their needs and their happiness. I made more of an effort to enjoy the small moments again, the ones that were easy to overlook when you were mired in grief. Slowly, but surely, I was learning to live again, not in the shadow of what I had lost, but in the light of what was still possible. It wasn't perfect. There were days when the sadness would come back, and I'd feel the weight of everything all over again. But with every small victory, I was rebuilding piece by piece, day by day. As the weeks passed, something incredible started to happen. I began to feel lighter. I wouldn't say I was happy yet, but I was certainly more at peace. The anger and frustration I'd carried for so long weren't as heavy anymore. I was still learning how to balance being a single dad and getting my life together, but the small steps I'd taken were paying off. I started looking at my life from a different angle, seeing things I hadn't before. The kids, for one, were my biggest reminder of why I needed to keep moving forward. They needed me. They needed stability, love, and guidance. But beyond that, they needed to see me thrive, to see me find joy again. That became my new focus, learning how to smile, really smile, again. I went out more. I joined friends for weekend hikes, went to concerts, and even started taking cooking classes. It was as if I was rediscovering the world that had felt so distant for so long. At first, I felt like an outsider, like I wasn't quite allowed to have fun because of everything I had gone through. But I quickly realized that life doesn't stop just because you're struggling. It keeps going, with or without you. The most surprising part? I was starting to have fun again. It wasn't perfect, of course. There were moments when I'd see something that reminded me of her, maybe it was a song we used to listen to or a particular place we used to visit, and I'd feel the sting of loss all over again. But it didn't consume me anymore. The grief was there, sure, but it was no longer my entire reality. One of the most profound shifts in my perspective happened one night when I was tucking my son into bed. He looked up at me with his big brown eyes and said, "Daddy, are you going to smile more now? I like it when you smile." I had no idea how much my sadness had affected him until that moment. That simple comment hit me harder than anything else. My son could see the difference in me. He could feel my absence, my emotional weight, and it was clear he missed the version of me that was happy and carefree. I promised him that I would do my best to smile more, to be the dad he deserved, and to show him that it was okay to move forward even after the hardest of times. That night, I sat on the couch after they went to bed and smiled. Not because I was pretending, but because I finally felt a bit of that old joy creeping back in. It felt good. The process of healing wasn't a straight line. There were days when I felt on top of the world, like I had everything figured out. And then there were days when I'd fall back into the sadness, the loneliness that had clung to me for so long. But, slowly, I began to realize that this was all part of the journey. There was no real finish line, just a continual evolution. Then, out of nowhere, I had a moment that I still think about to this day. It was a few months after everything had started to settle, and I was having a conversation with one of my old friends. We were talking about the ridiculous things we used to do back when we were younger, reminiscing about all the stupid pranks and inside jokes we used to share. And then, unexpectedly, the conversation shifted. He made this offhand remark, one of those comments that seemed completely innocent at the time but hit me like a wave of nostalgia. He casually said, "Man, your ex-wife always had the funniest sense of humor. Remember that time she..." And then he laughed. I hadn't expected to hear her name so casually in conversation, especially after everything that had happened. But the weirdest part was, for the first time, it didn't hurt. I didn't feel bitterness or resentment. Instead, I found myself laughing. And not in a bitter, forced way. It was genuine. That comment, her humor, was so her. It was exactly the kind of thing she would have said, and it was a reminder of the person she had been before all the messiness. The memory wasn't tainted by the pain. It wasn't overshadowed by the betrayal. It was just a memory. A simple, real moment of laughter. And it made me realize something important. I could laugh again. Not just at the past, but at life. It was like a weight had been lifted. I could look back at the good times and appreciate them without the anger clouding everything. It wasn't about forgiving her for everything that happened, it was about accepting that people have flaws, that life is messy, and that humor had always been a part of what made our time together special. That night, I found myself laughing again. And sometimes, when I'm feeling down, I remember that comment, and it makes me laugh all over again. I know she would have appreciated it. It was her humor, her lightness that kept us connected through all the chaos. And in that strange, unexpected moment, I realized that even after everything, she was still a part of me, her humor, her spirit. And I was okay with that. It wasn't just about laughter, though. That moment, that simple conversation, made me realize something bigger. I had been holding on to so much anger, hurt, frustration. I had been living in the past, constantly playing the what-if game, wondering if things could have been different. But I was starting to understand that it wasn't about changing the past. It was about accepting it and deciding to move forward. It took me a while to really let go of the anger. Even after I started laughing again, there were days when I still resented everything that had happened. I hated how she had left. I hated the lies, the betrayal, and the feeling of being abandoned. But slowly, piece by piece, I was starting to understand that it wasn't about her actions, it was about how I chose to respond. The choice was mine. I could keep holding on to the past, letting it dictate my future, or I could let go. I could choose to accept what had happened, acknowledge the pain, and start building something new. It wasn't easy. There were days when I felt like I was moving backward instead of forward. But every time I looked at my kids, I realized they deserved better. They deserved a dad who wasn't weighed down by the past, a dad who was ready to live in the present and build a future. I began making more intentional changes in my life. I spent time with my friends, built new hobbies, and focused on my own growth. I started taking care of my physical health, getting back into running and spending time outdoors. I realized that while I couldn't control what had happened to me, I could control how I responded. And in that moment, I decided to stop letting my past define me. I wasn't the broken man I had been when everything fell apart. I was someone who was learning, evolving, and building a new version of himself. And then, there was the question of love. I had spent so much time trying to figure out if I was ready to be in a relationship again, but the truth was, I wasn't sure. What I knew was that I was no longer running from my past. I had finally come to a place where I felt whole again, and if love came into my life, it would be because I was ready for it, not because I was looking to fill a void. I took it slow, allowed myself to explore the possibility of a future without the weight of past heartbreak, and when I was ready, I started considering the idea of meeting someone new, not to replace what I had lost, but to see what the future could offer. Looking back, there are a lot of things I would have done differently. But, at the same time, there's nothing I would change. Not because the pain didn't matter or because the heartbreak didn't leave its mark on me, but because I've learned so much from it. Sometimes, the hardest lessons are the ones that stick with you the longest, and I think this is one of those cases. I've learned that healing doesn't happen on a schedule. There's no set timeline for when you should feel better, or when you should have it all figured out. You just wake up one day and realize that, bit by bit, you've built something new out of the wreckage. It doesn't always feel perfect, but it's enough. I've learned that it's okay to not have all the answers and that it's okay to feel sad sometimes. Healing isn't linear, and it's okay to have bad days. The key is to not let those days define you. The other thing I learned is that life keeps moving, whether you're ready or not. I think I spent too much time looking backward, holding on to the past and the what-ifs. And while those thoughts can be important, they shouldn't control your future. I've learned to look forward with hope instead of fear, to embrace new opportunities, and to be open to what life throws my way. You never know what's coming next, but that's part of the adventure. And then there's the laughter. I never expected to find humor in something so painful, but here I am, sometimes remembering that conversation with my friend and laughing. It's not because the past is funny, but because I've learned to find joy in the small moments, even in the midst of hardship. I think my wife would have appreciated that. She always had a way of finding humor in the darkest of times, and I think she'd be happy to know that I've learned to do the same. As for the future, I'm not in a rush. I've learned that there's no hurry to figure everything out. The important thing is that I'm moving forward, taking it one day at a time. And whatever happens, I know now that I can handle it. I've been through more than I ever thought I could, and I've come out the other side stronger, wiser, and more at peace with myself than I ever thought possible. So, if there's one thing I can offer to anyone who finds themselves in a similar situation, it's this: don't let the past consume you. Take your time to heal, but remember that the future is waiting. Keep moving forward, even if it's just one small step at a time. And when you can, find the humor, the joy, and the love in the moments that make life worth living. Life isn't perfect, and love doesn't always look the way we expect it to, but it's always worth it. In the end, the journey is what shapes us, and that's something no one can ever take away.